All right, so in the previous module, we looked at how we would use MongoDB in the command line through the use of the Mongo shell. And that's pretty much MongoDB in its purest form in an isolated setting. But that's no use to us because we want to build applications that have databases, right? So we need to learn how to integrate our MongoDB database with our Node.js application. And that is what this module is all about. Now, when you're creating a Node app that needs to connect to a MongoDB database, there's essentially two options for you to choose from. One is to use the MongoDB native driver that we're going to talk about very quickly. Another is to use a ODM or an object document mapper that's called Mongoose. Now, the most popular way of working with MongoDB and Node.js is through using this package called Mongoose. And the reason is because it vastly simplifies and cuts down on the code that's required in order to work with your MongoDB database. But I want to show you first how the native MongoDB driver would work, and then we'll go through how to use Mongoose, just so that you can see for yourself just how much easier it is to incorporate Mongoose, and it makes your life as a developer so much better. But first, let's get started and take a look at how we would use the MongoDB native driver. Firstly, I want you to head over to the MongoDB documentation at docs.mongodb.com. And here we're going to head over to the tab that's called Drivers. And on the left-hand pane here, you can see that there's a whole bunch of drivers for different languages. Now, the driver is what's going to enable our MongoDB to interact with our application. And depending on which language your application was developed with, then you'll need to use a different driver. Now, in our case, we're going to choose Node.js, and we're going to view the latest documentation. And from here, we're going to head over to Quick Start. And it details pretty much step by step how you would get started using the native MongoDB Node.js driver. Well, that's quite a long sentence. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to glue together our MongoDB database with our Node.js application. And this is going to be the syntax and the code, and we're going to install the driver to enable us to do that. First things first, we're going to need a new project. For this project, I've decided that I'm going to make a database of fruits, and I'm going to rate all the fruits that I've tried. And there's some really wacky ones out there that I've come across through my travels, and I think it's a pretty nice way of showing you how to work with MongoDB and Node. CD over to wherever you keep all of your development files, and then we're going to create a new directory that's going to be called Fruits Project. And then we're going to head over to Fruits Project, and here we're going to create a new app. So we're going to create a new file called app.js, and as per usual, we're going to initialize our npm. But this time, instead, if you don't want to hit enter to insert the default values when you initialize npm, you can just add a Y flag, which basically says yes to everything. And when you hit enter, you can see that we've initialized our npm and accepted all of the defaults. So now all we have to do is to install the MongoDB driver. And to do that with npm, we have to install something called MongoDB. And remember, we don't need the -- save anymore as of the latest versions of npm. So we can simply say npm I, short for install, and then it's MongoDB. Hit enter, and that should install the driver in a couple of seconds. So now all we have to do is open up our app.js inside Atom and get started developing our new Node.js application that integrates with a MongoDB database. I'm just going to show you how we can get started using this by just using some of the code from their Getting Started guide. So I'm simply going to copy this part and add it to our app.js. And again, we've got a whole bunch of warnings, so let's just silence that from JS hint. And now I want to walk you through this code. First, we are requiring a package called MongoDB, and along with that package, we also insert another one called assert. Now, everything that you see that is related to assert, be it on Node.js applications or iOS applications, it's always to do with testing. And so you'll see that when we add a lot of the MongoDB code into our application, there's a lot of asserts that just validates our data entry and our connection to the MongoDB database. Now, the next part is the connection URL. And you can see this looks a little bit similar to what we've been using to develop websites on our local system. The important thing to note here is that when you're working with MongoDB, the port that they use is pretty much always 27017. And this is just some sort of arbitrary number that they've decided upon. This is the base URL for connecting to our database. And then we specify a database name. So let's change it to FruitsDB. And then we create a new Mongo client, which is going to connect to our MongoDB database. And if a FruitsDB doesn't exist, then it will create it. And if all of that happened without any errors, then we are going to log that we have connected successfully to the server. Once we're done, we're going to close the connection to our database. And this is all that this code does so far. The majority of it down here is just to create a new connection to a new database. And this is equivalent to when we saw in the Mongo shell previously, when we just said use FruitsDB. That use FruitsDB, if we wanted to use it in our Node.js application using the MongoDB native driver, is basically all of this code. So it's a bit crazy, and the reason why I'm walking you through this and explaining the code is that in reality, most developers who are working with Node and MongoDB will rarely use the native MongoDB driver. Now, it's not because it's no good, it works and it allows a lot of personalization, and you can drill down to the specifics and you can set up and use your MongoDB database with a high level of control. All right, so now that we have created this, let's go ahead and run our app.js using, again, node app.js. And you can see we get an error. And it says Mongo network error, failed to connect to server. And whenever you get this, you always have to remind yourself, do you still have the Mongo server up and running? So create a new tab, and remember, whenever we're using MongoDB, we always have to first run our server using the command mongod. And only once it's done running and it's waiting for connections on, again, that port 27017, it's going to come up in a lot of places. Well, now we're ready to actually connect to our database, and we can run node app.js again, and now we are successfully connected to the server. If at some point you get a deprecation warning, as you see here, then just read what the message says, because MongoDB, because it's relatively new, they will add new syntax and new code and new APIs and new ways of doing things on a regular basis. So in this case, it says deprecation warning, current URL string parser is deprecated and will be removed in a future version. To use the new parser, pass option this to the Mongo client.connect. If you didn't know what to do with this deprecation warning, then what do? Well, you just copy it in its entirety and then you paste it into Google and see what does Google say. So first link is a link to Stack Overflow, and it already tells you this is how you would work around it. So you can either change to a lower version of Mongo, which is not what we want to do. We want to work with the latest version. So if you do indeed want to use the latest version, then you will have to make your connection using this use new URL parser key value pair. And here they've got some example code of how you would add it. So they've added it to Mongo client.connect. You can see that even though we're taking the code from MongoDB using the latest version of their documentation, stuff gets out of date. And it's really important that you don't get fazed by every little thing that you see in the console and simply just Google for an answer. let's go back to Atom and let's go ahead and fix this. We're going to change our Mongo client to use the URL that we specified for our MongoDB server, but then we're going to add a comma and we're going to paste in that option that they wanted us to add. So there we go. Now let's hit save and let's rerun our app. You can see now we get connected successfully to server and we don't get any deprecation warnings. Even though the last time we did get this warning, our app is still running and connected successfully, so it didn't actually affect our app. But it's important that whenever you see a deprecation warning, to just copy and paste it into Google and see what the existing solutions are. It's very, very rare that you will be coming across a problem for the first time and you're the only person with that problem. It almost never happens. Okay, so now that we have connected successfully to our Mongo server, the next part is adding some data to our database. So how do we do that? Well, it's back to the documentation. And the next part is, of course, insert a document. So let's copy all of this code from the documentation and let's paste it below the last line that we have. So this code, what it does is it will create a new collection. And the collection that we're going to create is going to be called Fruits. We've got a collection called Fruits inside our Fruits DB. And this is equivalent to when we used our new database. And then we said db.fruits.insert. And then we get to insert some data in here. The data is in the same format as we saw before. It's a bunch of key value pairs. And here they're inserting 3 items into a field called A, and then they've added the values 1, 2, 3. So as we saw before in the Mongo shell, whenever you see a pair of curly brackets, that's going to be an individual document or an individual record. And in our case, we're going to insert 3 fruits. So I'm going to just paste in some code that I wrote a little bit earlier on, and we'll just format this so that you can see it more clearly. So here I'm inserting 3 documents, and each document is a fruit. So the first one has a name of apple, a score of 8, and a review of grapefruit. And the rest of them are for orange and banana. So we're now creating this array of fruits, and we're using the method insertMany, which comes from MongoDB, to insert all of these 3 documents into a collection called Fruits inside a database called FruitsDB. And down here, you can see that the next few lines are dedicated to validation. So they've added a whole bunch of asserts. And if we go through them line by line, this one says validate to make sure that there are no errors when we inserted our documents. And the next ones ensure that we have 3 results that are inserted into our collection. And if that is so, then we're going to log inserted 3 documents into the collection. And the next part is to simply run that function inside our insert documents function. And they show you that client.connect should now look like this with this additional part. Up here inside client.connect, instead of calling client.close, we're going to paste that new code which calls insert documents. And only once it's done inserting the documents do we close the connection to our database. So now let's hit save and let's again run our code with node app.js, and you can see we've successfully connected to the server and we've inserted 3 documents into the collection. And you can actually test out the validation quite easily. Say if we were only to add 2 records to our database, then you will get an assertion error saying that 3 doesn't equal 2. Well, you only inserted 2 items, but I was expecting 3. So you're already beginning to see the validation that we can place inside our app.js using the MongoDB driver in order to validate the data that we're inserting. And you can see just how very flexible all of these asserts are. If I head into my command line and I create a new terminal, and then I tap into the Mongo shell, and I say show DBs. You can see now, in addition to our shop DB, which we created inside the Mongo shell, we've also got this new database called fruits DB. And that one was not created using the Mongo shell, but instead from our Node.js app using the MongoDB driver. And that's where the fruits DB got created. And now if I say use fruits DB, then we can say show collections inside this DB. So we have this collection called fruits. And that, of course, comes from this part when we created our new collection using the db.collection method. And then we inserted a whole bunch of data, if you remember. So we should be able to say db.fruits.find. And we're going to leave the parentheses empty to show us all the data that we currently have. The keen-eyed amongst you will spot that we have 5 records instead of what you might expect to be 3, because the first time we added apple, orange, banana, and the second time we deleted the banana record and we got an assertion failure. Now, assertion is quite a complex topic, but in this case, this is a non-fatal assertion. So it won't actually prevent the insertion of these records, but it simply alerts you to the fact that the assertion has failed. So the next step is, how do we get our app.js to find all of these records? How do we read our data inside our Node.js app? Well, it's only a short scroll away. So the next part is find all documents. And let's just go ahead and add this into our code. Right at the bottom again, and this section we have to specify the collection where we want to find something from, which, if you remember earlier on, was called fruits. So let's change that to fruits, and then it's going to look through the collection and it's going to find all, and then it's going to save it into an array, and for that array we need to have some fruits. And in the callback, we're going to get back the object that we got from the find function, and we're going to log those fruits into the console. Now, if we hit save and call that find function inside, again, the client.connect. In this case, we're not going to insert any more documents. We're simply just going to find our document. So I'm just going to copy that part of the code, and we're going to update this method client.connect to delete the insertion method call and just find those records inside our database. Let's head back to our terminal connection where we've got our prompt, and let's call node app.js again. So now you can see that we've found the following records, and this printed in here is an array of JavaScript objects. And you can see it looks very similar to what we've got in the Mongo shell, but what's logged here are actually the documents from our MongoDB. But here we've actually got our JavaScript objects. So if we now have access to these living JavaScript objects inside an array in our app.js, then we can use our JavaScript code and Node.js to do whatever it is that we wish with it. As you can see, this code is very, very wordy, and there's a lot of it that's just boilerplate code that you have to add every single time you use the native MongoDB driver. And for some people, especially if you want to develop applications quickly, it can be a bit of a pain. So in the coming modules, I want to show you what most Node developers will work with, which is a module called Mongoose. And it will vastly simplify the code that we have here, and we will walk through how to use Mongoose to make your life developing Mongo and Node apps so much easier. So I'll see you there.